welcome to all of you back from lunch. I hope you've recovered a little. And as you might notice, we now switch to English. The presentation by Bontu Guschke will be in English. So we will have a common language, and it's the language in which your PhD is written. Also, very warm welcome again to Bontu Guschke. As organizers, we are really so happy to have you here today because your PhD touches upon so many points we have been discussing the last 2 days. So for those in the audience who were here at the conference yesterday, Guschke is already familiar, but for those who are new here, I've seen some new faces. I will shortly introduce her again. So Dr. Bontu Guschke, and her pronouns are she, her, is a researcher, facilitator, and speaker on diversity and anti-discrimination. She conducts research in the area of queer and anti-feminist research and theory. Today's presentation will be based on her PhD that she ended at the Department of Organization at the Copenhagen Business School, researching the persistence of sexism and racism at universities. Her research interests, moreover, include intersectional feminist organizational analysis, queer feminism and norm-critical theory, anti-racism research, feminist epistemologies, and the interplay of discourse and affect analysis. I think that's a very interesting topic. So next to her research, she works as a consultant, facilitator, and speaker, supporting organizations in developing diverse and inclusive work environments. Her work has been published in international peer-reviewed journals, and she is an editor from Femina Politica, which some of you might know, and also the journal Women, Gender and Research. So online you can find a very interesting list of publications. I will just name 2 of recently appeared papers. So one is called Solidarity Across Difference, Rethinking Transformational Critique from Black Feminist and Postcolonial Perspectives, came out in 2024. And another one came out in 2023, Belästigung und Diskriminierung als normalisierter Teil des Hochschularbeitsalltags, ein Einblick in Forschung zu Sexismus und Rassismus an Universitäten. And this is a topic we will now hear more about. So the floor is yours. Great to have you here.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much also for the invitation. I was very happy when I received this invitation. I was very happy to be here over the last days. I think, as we have seen, this is a very important conference that not only shows all the work that has been done, but also the work that needs to continue and that will continue, as I think especially the last session we saw. And I'm very grateful that I can contribute with my input to this conference. As you can see, I will talk about the persistence of sexist and racist harassment at universities, and I will do so specifically looking at the intersection of racism and sexism. Before I start, I just want to highlight that as an organization scholar, which I am by training, I'm looking at universities as organizations and as workplaces. But it is important for me to highlight that, of course, universities, first of all, are not the only workplaces in higher education. There are others as well. And that also workplaces at universities are not just like any workplace, but that because they happen within higher education, they have a specific importance, I think, for us as a society. Because universities, does it still work? Yeah. Because universities and higher education is still one of the most important places for knowledge production, definitely not the only one, but it is one of the most important ones where we create the knowledge that we then use to understand ourselves, our societies, to use as a basis for decision-making also politically. And it matters who is part of that process. It matters who is part of these spaces and who is part of these spaces feeling safe being there as a researcher, being there as a teacher, being there in administration. So it's really important that we keep that in mind when we talk about universities, that we talk about one of the core institutions of our society. So I just want to point that out, even though I will, as I said, take this perspective of universities as workplaces. Is it okay with the microphone? I could see some frowning, yeah? Okay, perfect. I guess what I just said should already be enough reason for why we should study sexism and racism in higher education. And I'm also quite sure that in this room here, I don't really have to convince any of you that this is important. I guess many of us agree. Nonetheless, I want to share a few points of why exactly it is so important, but also so challenging to talk about these topics and to do this kind of research. In my case, I did my research in Denmark, but as I've come to learn and as I've come to learn also from discussions with many of you and other scholars, we see similar things happening in other European countries as well. The first one to point out is a myth of gender equality in a post-feminist gender regime, meaning this very strong societal narrative that sexism is a problem of the past. We have overcome this, and we can almost in the same breath talk positively about the feminism of the past, but also use that to then argue we don't need to do that anymore. We have achieved gender equality, which is of course not true. So it is a myth. Sexism continues to exist. Gender equality has not been achieved, but this narrative and this post-feminist gender regime is important to point out because it shows why it is so hard to bring this topic up again and again. At the same time, we have an equally strong myth of racial exceptionalism, which in this case means that racism as a problem is put elsewhere. So sexism, we leave it in the past. Racism, that happens elsewhere, not here. We look at the US, we look at the UK, we look at other places and claim this is where racism is a problem, but it's not something that we have here in Denmark, in Switzerland, in Germany, which is of course not true. And finally, when we look specifically at the sector of higher education, we have what I call a myth of meritocracy. So this belief that even though in society maybe we're sexist and racist, here we're in a setting of people who are educated, enlightened, who don't reproduce these things, and where decisions are based on merit and fair criteria. So those who don't make it were simply not good enough. And I'll come back to that later. But first of all, of course, higher education universities exist within society. They're not outside of that. And they have historically been built on mechanisms of exclusion. The reason why I mention this is because I think we need to remind ourselves again and again that when we try to talk about, when we try to study, when we try to push for changes in these areas, we are indeed challenging a very fundamental belief that we hold as a society and that we hold within the higher education system. And that is why we so often face resistances when we try to call out these problems that of course do continuously exist. So this is what we know. These problems exist, but often we meet resistance when we try to talk about them. What I was specifically then interested in my research is how come that harassment and discrimination keep happening at universities. So I'm not asking, how does it happen? Well, first of all, I'm not asking, does it happen? I'm also not asking, how much does it happen, or how does it happen, or what are the effects? These are important things, but they're covered in other studies. What I was curious to understand is how come that even though over decades now, but also again in the last years with movements like Me Too, with movements like Black Lives Matter, also with confirmations often that workplaces should be free of discrimination and that we have zero tolerance for any form of discrimination and harassment, how come that we have this persistence that harassment and discrimination nonetheless continue to be reproduced? Specifically, I want to share with you 3 questions that were guiding this research. The first one was to ask, how does the disorganization of universities enable the reproduction of inequalities, and specifically here sexist and racist harassment and discrimination? Why is this important? Well, what I realized is that many studies still look or research harassment and discrimination as happening due to certain mismanagement in an otherwise well-functioning organization, rather than what I'm trying to do here, recognizing that they are a fundamental part of how the university is structured as an organization. And I'll come back to what exactly I mean with this idea of disorganization. Secondly, I also found it quite interesting that the research we have commonly focuses either on the structural level, so we might look at gendered and racialized power structures, inequality regimes, organizational cultures, or we have the individual level where we ask questions about what do people experience, what are the consequences of that, how might targets feel, what are maybe also strategies of ignorance or threats that are used by perpetrators. And both of that is extremely important, but what I was missing was the link that also asks what allows sexist and racist workplace harassment and discrimination to be reproduced both on an institutional, structural, and an interactional individual level, and to always think about how these two play into one another. And then finally, a lot of this research that we have on sexist or on harassment, broadly speaking, looks at gender-based violence, looks at sexual harassment, and leaves out any intersectional perspective, and specifically also perspectives that look at racism as well. So it was important for me to ask how is sexist and racist harassment and discrimination reproduced intersectionally, and also what is distinct in how they're reproduced, particularly also what is distinct in how racism is reproduced at universities that we might not cover if we only look at sexism with this monothematic focus. As I said, I want to come back to a couple of the terminologies and also underlying theories that I use here that are important for my work, but I think also important for the discourse that we can have collectively about these issues. It's three theoretical anchors that I want to briefly touch upon. The first one being the idea of disorganization. Disorganization theory is a stream within organization theory, which is my field, as I mentioned, which basically argues that organizations are never just these neatly organized and ordered places, but they're always shaped by contradictions and by paradoxes between organization and disorganization. And this is important because what it means is that our role as scholars, but also as practitioners in these fields, is not to necessarily find out or identify what is the right way to organize, and then anything else that doesn't fit in there, we label it as mismanagement, as these small but unfortunate mistakes in our otherwise well-functioning system, but that we actually explore how organization always occurs in contradictory ways, and how some of the things that on the one hand side help us organize our system also facilitate harassment and discrimination at the same time. So what it allows me to do is to exactly explore how harassment and discrimination are part of the very way in which universities are organized, and have been organized also for centuries and, for decades and centuries, we have to say, and how that facilitates harassment and discrimination. A second point that was really important for me, and that I think we also need to talk about more when we talk about these issues, are issues of vulnerability and autonomy. Because when we work with discrimination and harassment, we also work with, in the best case with, or we talk about, people who are affected by discrimination, who are marginalized and excluded. And this raises questions about their vulnerability in these systems, but also their autonomy. My understanding of vulnerability and autonomy is a relational one. What do I mean by that? I mean that my underlying premise is that we as human beings are always inherently vulnerable to one another. So we are dependent on other people, and we are dependent on our effective relationships with other people to survive. So our very being is a vulnerable one. At the same time, it's important that while this ontological vulnerability exists for all of us, we're of course not all similarly vulnerable at the same time. So there are specific socio-material conditions that create conditions of precariousness, so a form of vulnerability that is differently distributed when we think about the university system. A PhD student, for example, who is dependent on their supervisor for funding, for networks, for feedback, for access, is of course differently vulnerable in that system than a tenured professor who has their own staff, who has their own funding, who has a secure position. Now, you could still argue if I say we're all vulnerable always to another ontologically, no one has any autonomy. But that's not the idea of autonomy that I support, but I argue that autonomy is equally relationally tied. So it's not this understanding of a fully independent individual that takes decisions completely unaffected by any socio-material and relational conditions. Honestly, I don't think that's possible for anyone. But rather to see autonomy as a capability that also develops relationally. So first, you need people who help you develop that capability and train it. We can, of course, think of children here who learn from their parents, but we can, in an organizational context, also think of new members to an organization who need support learning how you enact your autonomy in these settings. And second, you also need actual support in enacting your autonomy. So there can be conditions that hinder you in actually taking the decisions you would like to take and enacting that autonomously. And often these are gendered and racialized, because often it comes down to a lack of resources to enact your choices, a lack of formal or informal power to actually do what you want to do. Also, often a lack of time to even consider what possibilities you would have and how you could enact them. So what this essentially means is that as human beings, we can and we actually are always vulnerable and autonomous at the same time. And it is actually, and this is important to me, it is actually our ontological vulnerability to others that allows us to use that relationality to develop autonomous capabilities. So vulnerability and autonomy are really intimately tied here. And at the same time, we also have to recognize that the precariousness of this situational, contextual vulnerability can create factors and conditions that hinder our enactment of autonomy. So vulnerability can restrict autonomy, but not necessarily. And I'll come back to that in the analysis because it's an important point in how we think about victims, targets, survivors of harassment and discrimination. And finally, I want to say a couple of words about the understanding of discrimination that I work with and highlight one perspective that I found particularly helpful, namely the concept of everyday discrimination by Philomena Isset. What everyday discrimination describes is how seemingly small but repeated acts of sexist and racist harassment and discrimination in the everyday, and this can of course be your organizational everyday at the university, work as so-called situational activations of broader discriminatory structures. So they are, in fact, not as trivial and small and random as they might seem, but there are both a sign of broader discriminatory structures on an institutional level, as well as part of reproducing them. So we have again here this circular movement. But exactly because they look so seemingly small, they're often not recognized as such. They go unnoticed, they become normalized, and that's exactly how they reproduce mechanisms of exclusion that then become structural. I found this concept particularly helpful because it captures this interplay between the two different levels, and it shows how these situational activations are these situational activations that happen on the individual level. They are a manifestation of, but they also manifest the structural inequalities, and this is something I think we always need to keep in mind. Now, how did I actually go about this research? As I said, my work is based in Denmark, so I conducted qualitative interviews with people working at Danish universities, the 8 main Danish universities, and that was PhD students, postdocs, professors at different levels, heads of department, institute leaders, etc. And my aim was to speak both with people who said that they have their own experiences with harassment and discrimination, but also with those who said, honestly, I have absolutely nothing to do with this, because I was interested in what people name as their understanding of what harassment and discrimination is, if and how it plays a role in the university, and if so, for whom and in what forms and expressions. And also finally, how they think, if and how they think harassment and discrimination should be dealt with. What was important for me here is to not only grasp those straight, normative, expected narratives that I could maybe also read up on the university website, but really, on the one hand side, link to those organizational norms. So of course, the narrative that we share at a university shapes what we then understand as harassment and discrimination, but at the same time, work with an approach that also makes me recognize the differences in understanding and the differences of reproducing these understandings on an individual level. And therefore, I worked with an approach called anti-narrative research. What anti-narrative research aims to do is to understand how, why, and also at what cost these idealized narratives actually come about. So how are they formed and how are they sustained? It is therefore again an approach that looks at the organizational structures, but also at their individual reproductions and the breaking points of where maybe on an individual level we try to reproduce them with a difference. So it's an approach that allowed me to pay attention to both levels. For example, let's say I would try to find out what is the normative official narrative of what racism is at this university and whether or not it exists here. But also, how does that potentially break with what people actually experience on an individual level? And how does that influence one another, both in the sense of, do I recognize things that happen to me as harassment if they're not named as such? But also, does my individual experience have an influence of how we collectively here at the university talk about racism? So again, looking at the interplay. But what was challenging is that I actually needed an approach to look at and identify where organizational structures are reproduced and where these individual differences take place. And I spent quite a lot of time thinking and discussing that and developed an approach that I call embodied queer listening. What was important to me here was it's an approach that reflects this idea of anti-narrative research, and it is a technique for attending to embodiment, to affect, and also to atmosphere, not as a disturbance to qualitative interviews as we so often think about it, but actually as effective intensities that might exactly reveal something about the organizational structures and about their individual interactional reproduction. So embodied queer listening, you could say, is a way to capture, to analyze, and then also to write embodied experiences into the study as a legitimate source of knowledge that would otherwise quite easily be suppressed if we only look at the discursive side. It is thereby also an approach that is inherently inspired by anti-racist, Black feminist, and post-colonial work in arguing that the body and the mind can and should not be separated in research work, and that we really have to think about how we can reconnect them in our knowledge production. To give you a couple of examples of what does that actually mean? One thing I would do in my interviews is that I would read out short vignettes, which are potential stories of situations of harassment. And I would ask the interviewees to close their eyes and to listen to these stories with their bodies. And the first question I would ask them afterwards is, what did you feel? And we wouldn't necessarily talk about, was this right or wrong? Did the person do the right or the wrong thing? But which parts of the story made me feel what? And then we take that as a starting point for our conversation about, okay, what is happening here? Why did this make me feel angry, insecure, whatever else came up? I also used it as part of my own data analysis. So both during and after the interviews, I would almost have like a field notebook, a logbook, where I captured those affective intensities that arose for me, and to also use them then later in the analysis as starting points that might also reveal something about my own normative expectations that were maybe broken in that moment of the interview, and also use that as starting points for the analysis. And then finally, I also came to writing and thinking about how do I actually give a voice to these affective and emotional intensities that were rising in the data. What do I do with that? It doesn't really fit the way that I was trained to write as an academic. So I started working with embodied vignettes, and I also wrote a couple of poems, actually, or poetic sketches, as I sometimes rather call them, to express those affective intensities that were arising, and to really give them the space also in the written knowledge production. Where did this lead me? The first thing that I did is to really look at the context of universities within higher education and to analyze the way in which universities are organized and how that facilitates harassment and discrimination. And a few things are relevant here. In total, I identified 7 mechanisms, contextual mechanisms, that I argue are fruitful in analyzing harassment and discrimination. And I want to give you a few examples. The first one is that academia is a setting of high competition and high precarity, which is, as we also discussed earlier, supposed, or at least in one of the groups I remember, is supposed to foster excellence. So this idea of it's hard to get ahead, only the best ones will make it, and therefore we will reach the best research. That's the main underlying idea. But what it also leads to is that, because as I argued earlier, it is a myth of meritocracy in the way that it actually functions, is that you need a lot of personal relationships to get ahead in your career, and you're very dependent on your good reputation as an excellent scholar and your network. And it leads to 2 things. The first thing is, and many people have said that, they don't want to be associated in any way with a harassment discrimination case as a bystander or a witness, because it might label them as troublemakers. So it's a setting in which it is not a priority for people to engage with what we might label social justice work, what we might also just label doing the right thing, because it might actually hinder your already precarious career. A second thing it leads to is that this reliance on networks means that it's easier to get ahead and to succeed if you have allies and supporters in the system. And one aspect that I thought was interesting and important to point out here is that this has different effects for different groups of marginalized people. So different for people who are marginalized because of their gender and those who are marginalized because of their race. Because what a lack of a strong network leads to is, on the one hand, hierarchical dependency. So you're often dependent on very few, maybe even one very powerful person in your field who helps you get ahead. And the other thing it leads to is isolation. So you are isolated within the higher education system because you don't have people who support you. Now, what I found is that white women that I talk to usually face a lot of sexism quite early in their careers because of the hierarchical dependencies where you're relying on a single powerful person, mostly single powerful men. And because of that hierarchical dependency, there's a high chance that this power is misused and it leads to sexual harassment. And of course, this is very unfortunate because already at this point, many people, many women leave the academic system because they cannot sustain in a system where they're continuously harassed and they are dependent on this person to get ahead. So either you play along or you're out. What happens, however, is that those who do make it through are usually, when they're higher up, quite well connected to other white women. We do, at this point, have quite a lot of networks, I guess, as we could also see earlier, where mostly white women are connected to one another. And it becomes easier to not face this issue of isolation so much, and that is a buffer for issues of sexism. However, Black women and women of color experience similar forms of sexism and sexual harassment early on in their career. However, even when they go higher up in the ranks, the hierarchical dependencies disappear, but the isolation does not. So even when you make it to a higher position, you're still isolated among their primarily white colleagues. So the risk for experiencing racism and racialized sexual harassment continues even when you are higher up, because you're not buffered in the same way when climbing up the career ladder. And this is an important point to keep in mind, for example, that we would overlook if we don't look at it from this intersectional perspective and also recognize the differences for different groups of women in this case. Another example of how the context of higher education is facilitative of sexism and racism is the role of academic freedom and relatedly conflict, which is to say that academic freedom is one of the highest values, I guess, that many of us or all of us share, and it is essential for making academic research possible. At the same time, I realized that it often comes with a certain glorification of conflict and this idea that we have to constantly fight and argue for the best argument. And that makes it very easy, actually, to disguise especially verbal instances of harassment and discrimination as normal academic conflict that you just need to learn to live with. Just toughen up. If you can't stand it, well, then this is just not your place. And the third and final one that I want to highlight today is what I already touched upon earlier, the strong belief in meritocracy and the idea of enlightened academia, which means also that people who try to speak up about harassment and discrimination are often told something like this does not happen here. Everyone is educated and knows better, as if sexism and racism is something that accidentally happens to those who simply do not know better. What is important to me is that when I mention these factors here, I'm not saying that they will inevitably lead to harassment and discrimination. I'm also not at all saying let's get rid of academic freedom and personal relationships because they always lead to these things. What is important for me, and this is why I work with this idea of disorganization, is to say many of these aspects are actually important in how we organize universities, and they have a function. At the same time, we need to recognize that, especially in how they play together, they do facilitate harassment and discrimination, and we need to keep that in mind when we want to go against it, that we can't just change a little bit here, but keep everything else intact when it is indeed the very way in which we organize, which also disorganizes universities in a way that is exclusionary to many. This is the overall context. What I found quite striking in this context is what I call the unspeakability of racism. As I said already in the beginning, it was quite important for me to not look at this issue from this monothematic focus on gender, which then often excludes many other perspectives. And one of the things that I noticed was that nonetheless, when I did the interviews, the interviewees would immediately, so I would just say it's about harassment and discrimination, and they would immediately jump to sexist harassment and gender discrimination. Sometimes, and this links to what we were talking about yesterday on the panel, they would mention the word intersectionality and say something like, yes, it's about sexism and gender discrimination. Of course, we also have to think about it intersectionally, but here the problem is really sexism. So it was used, as I was describing yesterday, not with a clear understanding of what intersectionality means and what other problems this might point to, but in fact as a concept that was used as an empty signifier, but rerouting attention back to the issue of gender and sexism. Even when I specifically then asked about ethnicity, race, religion, racist harassment, the answer would usually be, I don't know, we don't have that here. And at the same time, and this is where I started to think about how do I actually do this research, at the same time there were several situations in which race and racism were present in the interview, even if, or sometimes I would say especially because they were not talked about. They were noticeable in uncomfortable silences when I brought this up, in nervous laughter, there were jokes that were being told, and there were also situations which sometimes only later I would recognize as racist microaggressions against myself. So I needed to find a way to analytically capture and write about the racism that was effectively present in the room, in the atmosphere, in this encounter, but it was not spoken about because there were no adequate words for it. And to exactly capture this, I developed this term of, or I work with this term of the unspeakability of racism, which is to say that not only is racism not spoken about, but not speaking of racism, so its unspeakability, is part of reproducing it within the university system. Because by not putting words to it, we are not allowing it to become an issue that we could then start talking about and addressing and dealing with. This is also, as you can also see on the slide, the point where these embodied vignettes and also the poetic sketches became quite important, because how do you write about something that is not put into words? I did not have that many interview quotes. So I used vignettes and poems to express my embodied sensations in that moment, to write also about the atmosphere in the room, and to write about my discomfort with the racist tensions that were effectively present, but not released into words, but that I think are an important part of the knowledge that was produced in this research. This difficulty of putting things into words also leads me to my next point on the imperceptibility of harassment experiences. What do I mean by that? Imperceptibility is a term that I take from François Julien, who writes that changes are imperceptible, which means that they're not necessarily invisible, because often, especially to those of us who are experiencing discrimination, many things that are invisible for others are quite visible for us. But what he argues is they're silent, yet detrimental. He writes that transformation is silent, it operates without warning, without giving an alert, without attracting attention, as though independently of us, without wanting to disturb us. In silence, even when it continues on its way within us until it destroys us. And this feeling of a silent transformation on the inside that only becomes visible or noticeable when it has already destroyed you is actually quite accurately the way in which many people I talk to, many interviewees, describe the experience of harassment. And this is problematic, or a problem for us, because we often think that harassment will be this one big instance that will be very clearly identifiable. But actually the way that harassment works is that it often starts with very small instances, very small boundary transgressions, or even more like a stretching of boundaries in the everyday that is at first hardly noticeable. And many interviews actually said, you know, in the beginning I could feel it in my body. I would feel anxious about coming to work or entering certain rooms or seeing certain people. Maybe I would feel dizzy or a bit sick, but I couldn't really pinpoint to it. And also somehow it didn't seem severe enough to say anything. It seemed too early to do anything. These instances would usually continue. They would get more and more severe, and leading to a point where people then would say, or would realize, that they're so caught up in a harassment relationship with the perpetrator and in the sense so vulnerable, and I'm talking here about the contextual, situational vulnerability of precariousness, so vulnerable to the influence of the perpetrator, that it was actually very difficult at this point to see the bigger picture, or as one interview said, to put all the puzzle pieces together. So what I would actually usually need is someone to say, hey, what this person is doing to you, or what you're describing this person to do, is not okay, and I will support you if you want to do something about it, as a first step for the harassed person to get out of the situation. And it's not about rescuing a vulnerable victim or acting for them, but it's about recognizing that they're in an extremely vulnerable situation. As I was saying earlier, we do need support to enact our autonomy in these extremely vulnerable situations, and this is why it is so important to have people who take that step with you. However, detrimentally at this point, what many said is that they actually felt it's too late to speak up, it's too late to do anything, because now that I realize it, why have I not said anything earlier? Why have I not done anything before? And who will believe me now? Will I not be met with this argument of, but why have you let it go on for so long? Were you not agreeing to it if it continued until now? So it leads to a situation where there's imperceptibility of harassment, that it silently, unnoticedly destroys you, both in an embodied way, you feel sick, anxious, etc., but also in the sense of harming your autonomy, that leads to a situation where there is no right point to just, as we often say, to just speak up about harassment, because it's either always too early or too late. Where does this leave us? The important points that I hope this carries forward is, first of all, to insist that sexist and racist harassment and discrimination are not unfortunate mistakes in an otherwise well-functioning higher education system, but that it is a complex interplay of organizational structures, processes, and also practices that on the one hand organize academic workplaces and at the same time facilitate the reproduction of harassment and discrimination, which means that universities are inherently discriminatory organizations. And we need to keep that in mind if we want to tackle harassment and discrimination. One aspect why it is so difficult to talk specifically about sexist and racist harassment is that it always seems too early or too late. So because of harassment being accumulative and imperceptible, as I've shown, it's almost impossible to just avoid or escape or just speak up about it in a viable way. And finally, a point that is really important for me to stress is that there's almost this additional layer that hides racism, namely its unspeakability, which means that even though racism is often present, it is not spoken about, wherefore it is reproduced unnoticed, which also means that no matter how uncomfortable we might find it, we need to get better at recognizing and acknowledging and naming racism and listening to those who try to speak up about it. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time on highlighting these problems, and that lies at the core of my research. Sorry. I was hoping that my voice does not leave me in the middle of this. Nonetheless, it's quite important for me, and I think it's important also for this conference to also discuss how we can start addressing the problem. Therefore, let me end with sharing a couple of pointers based on my research of what I think is important in terms of confronting harassment and discrimination. The first one being about prevention. What many organizations and universities do to achieve this at this point is collecting data on how many reported cases of harassment and discrimination they have, and then setting themselves the goal to get this number down to 0. It's actually a really bad idea. Don't get me wrong, we need the data on it, we need the monitoring, so if you're not monitoring yet, please try to initiate it. If you're doing it, continue doing it. But this setting yourself a goal of having 0 reported cases is actually a huge incentive for people not to report. It's not an incentive not to harass. It's an incentive not to report, or for report not to be processed all the way through to maybe find a way to do it differently, because you don't want to be the one person, the one group, the one department that ruins the 0 case statistic. It's also a bad idea because it assumes that the number of reported cases is actually a good indicator of the harassment that is going on at the university. And as I have just shown, much of harassment happens imperceptibly and parts of it stays unspeakable. So we cannot assume that those parts that we recognize, speak about, and report are actually the full number of cases that happen. Some even go so far to argue that if you have rising numbers of harassment cases in your statistics, it might be a good sign in the sense that more people trust your organization and your organizational processes to come forward with their claims. So instead of building your work on this annual monitoring of harassment discrimination case reporting numbers, I think that prevention should happen as an ongoing proactive practice of creating working environments free of harassment discrimination. What this means, for example, is regular conversations about what is accepted here and what is not, what is okay and what is not at our workplace. It also means, for example, to not only write a harassment and discrimination or diversity or 0 tolerance policy or a DEI statement and then putting it on the website and leaving it there, but for example, to make it mandatory for all groups, for all departments, to regularly discuss this policy and actually look at what does this mean for us as we're working here? How are we implementing this and how not? How does it maybe also not work and what else should we do on top of that? So it's about making these issues a priority, and a priority also means priority in terms of time and in terms of money, as we talked about. Second, when harassment and discrimination happens, because no matter how good we're going to get with our prevention, we need to be aware that it will continue to happen. We need better reporting processes in place. And reporting processes today are built upon this assumption that I was talking about, that harassment is this one big instance that would be clearly identifiable, easy to describe, write down, report, and then process. But that's hardly ever the case. As I showed, it happens imperceptible, and it's impossible to just speak up or just report. So both in our universities, but also I would say when we, for example, organize a conference like this one, we need support structures that do not necessarily require only the individual to be the ones carrying the burden and the responsibility for identifying, naming, and speaking up. I think we're here sometimes mistaking the right to speak up with the responsibility to speak up and solve the issue. To avoid that, we need two things. We need better bystander trainings, which means teaching academic staff what to do when they realize or suspect that someone is experiencing harassment and discrimination, and how they can support that, how they can not support the harassment, how they can support the speaking up and seeking of help. Because as I said, one of the things I can see is how important it is to have someone to help you put the puzzle pieces together, and as a first step, that means believing people who speak up about their experiences, and then also knowing the processes and knowing what it means to report. Many people were saying, I feel like I just get into a huge mess when I try to support someone in reporting. So we need better processes, but then also more transparency about what it actually entails so that people can take an informed decision if this is something they want to do or not. Secondly, we also need reporting mechanisms that don't wait for things to escalate before they seem accessible. So at this moment that I was talking about, where people feel like it's still too early to really do something, this is the moment where we already need access points where people can share their concerns. Maybe this is not a formalized reporting process at this point, because not in all cases will it need reporting, but we need some kind of recording possibility where people can discuss, share, and get support in recognizing what is going on, and then being informed of the next possible steps that they might or might not want to take. And last but not least, I think it needs a willingness to stay with the trouble, because confronting workplace harassment and discrimination is difficult. It's a struggle, it's a long-term process, but at the same time, I think if we continue to do it, it will be hugely rewarding for the people involved, and involved are not only those who are attacked by it, for the universities as such, and also for us as a society. Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing with you.